Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for checking out the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages today. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, but today we are also joined by my co-host, Nathan Shullen. Nathan Shullen, give a shout out to the channel.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
We are joined today by Dr. Rohl. Many of you are actually going to be familiar with his work, but for some of you who are not, I want to actually introduce him, have him tell us a little bit about himself, and then we're going to take you on a very interesting and intense episode. Dr. Rohl, thank you so much for coming on today.
It's good to be here. So the big question is, how did it all kick off in the first place? Well, when I was 7, I was writing hieroglyphs at the age of 7 years old. I've got an exercise book that I still keep now that's dated to around what would be about 1958, around that time. And I was writing hieroglyphs of all the kings of Egypt, and then another column had the Greek names of the kings and also their regnal dates as well. So I was into all this stuff at a very early age. And then I went to Egypt for the first time at the age of 9 and traveled all the way up to Abu Simbel, up the river, on King Farouk's paddle steamer. He'd been kicked out of the country, and I was allowed to travel on his paddle steamer, sleeping in his bed, no less. And so I had a very early introduction to Egypt, and I've loved the subject ever since. Although I went into other fields in my teens. I was a rock musician, and I played in various bands, and I became a sound engineer and a record producer for about 25, 30 years. And I went back to study ancient Egypt as a mature student. And that's when I got all my degrees in Egyptology and ancient history. So I've got the full rack of qualifications, but I have a rock and roll attitude towards the subject.
For our first question,
yeah.
I thought I would start off with the very basics. So what made you begin to question that our current view on chronology was wrong? Were you the first, or have there been others within academia that have questioned our view on chronology as well?
Well, I started getting interested in the subject in the 1970s when I read a little blue book by Professor Kenneth Kitchen called The Third Intermediate Period in Egypt. And that sounds like a mouthful. It basically is the period after the New Kingdom, before the late period. So it's dynasties 21 to 25. So that's when I got interested, because I started reading this book, which had all the information in it there for students. And I realized that there were problems with this book. All the data was there, but the interpretations were a bit dodgy. So that's when I got into it for the first time. But I mean, other people have been doing this for donkey's years. An expression that Americans don't actually know very well, but it means a long time ago. Isaac Newton, 17th century. He was one of the first to start trying to piece together the names of Egyptian kings with the Bible. And he identified the pharaoh Shishak of the Bible, who sacked the Temple of Solomon, as Ramesses II. Now, I do that as well. So, hundreds of years later, we have somebody, a great scholar from the past, who has similar ideas, or had similar ideas to what I do today. And then you've got people like Professor Jens Lieblein, who was a Norwegian scholar, and he came up with the idea that that you had to join the 21st and 22nd dynasty, put them contemporary with each other. Again, it's something which I do as well. So I'm not the first to suggest these ideas. You have Cecil Tor. Cecil Tor had a big fight with Flinders Petrie, the great Egyptian archaeologist, about the dating of the Greek Dark Age in relationship to Egypt, because Petrie had found Greek pottery, Mycenaean pottery, at Tel el Amana, and then he dated the Mycenaean age on the basis of the Egyptian chronology, and Cecil Tor was not happy with that at all. And then, of course, you've got the perhaps more famous, people might know him better, would be Immanuel Velikovsky in the 1950s, who had a go at redating Egyptian history, and he was followed by somebody called Donovan Corville, who also had a go at it. So I'm one of the last in the line, to be honest, to be doing this, and there are many going to be following me in the years to come, I'm sure.
Especially, it seems like it's gaining more ground today. That's very interesting. I'll be curious to see what work's being put out, let's say 10 or 15 years from now.
Well, hopefully there'll be works that actually approve what I'm doing.
Exactly. Then people will be referring to you as one of the pioneers on the subject, of course.
Well, I don't know. I'm sure I'll be dead and buried long before that happens.
What are some of the implications on different Egyptian dynasties ruling at the same time? I know in chronology, I've been hearing, they like to date it like one right after the other. But if some of them are going at the same time, is there something that conventional Egyptologists are reserved to acknowledge with that? The pharaohs might not be in sequential order, especially given the third intermediate period.
Well, actually, I would say that 99.9% of Egyptologists accept there are overlaps between the dynasties. And when we do accept that in what we call intermediate periods, let's define what an intermediate period is. It's a period when one king doesn't rule the whole country at the whole time. Those are the kingdom periods, we call those. So Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. We have a single ruler usually, sometimes a co-regency, ruling the whole country. In the third intermediate period, for instance, which is the one I study, there were several dynasties ruling at the same time, and that's acknowledged by most Egyptologists. It's just that they don't go as far as I do in overlapping the dynasties. I do actually overlap the 21st and 22nd dynasty. Most Egyptologists would not agree to that or agree with that, but they do agree, for instance, that there's a Theban 21st dynasty and a Memphite 21st dynasty also ruling at Tanis. They also agree that the start of the 25th dynasty overlaps the end of the 22nd dynasty. So these overlaps are well known and established within scholarship. So it's not a new idea, and even Manetho himself told us that some of the dynasties overlapped each other.
In your book, Pharaohs and Kings, you mention biblical chronologists ignore Jephthah datum, which would prove that the Exodus would have happened around 1460 BC. Therefore, Ramesses II could not have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Why would biblical chronologists choose to ignore this piece of vital information?
Simply because in the first chapter of Exodus, the first book, part of the Exodus story, it tells us that the Israelite slaves built a city called Ramses and another one called Pithom. So they automatically assume that Ramses is the city that Ramesses II built in the Eastern Delta, which is called Pi-Ramesse by Egyptologists. So they go with that, and then they end up arguing that then you have to shorten the time period from year 4 of Solomon, when he built the temple, all the way back to the Exodus. The Bible says it's 480 years, that interval of time. But you can't do that if you've got Ramesses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So what they do is they say, oh, okay, 480 years, you can divide that by 40, can't you? Yeah, okay, well, there's 12 generations of 40 years. But we all know that no generation was 40 years. It's much shorter than that. So what we'll do is we'll make a generation 23 years, multiply that by 12, and we get a completely different period of time altogether. So we end up with an Exodus taking place around 1252 BC, 1250 BC, which is smack in the middle of Ramesses II's reign.
So it's like from the father, from the birth of his son to the time that he would be old enough to have kids. That would be like what we would consider like a generation.
Yeah, it is important to define what a generation is. Now, the Bible has this word dor for generation, but actually it doesn't mean a generation. It means a lifespan, a period from the birth of somebody to their death, a typical average lifespan of 40 years. When we look at generations, the real generations, it's when a father gives birth to his eldest surviving son, and that son gives birth to his eldest surviving son. So it's approximately in the ancient world around 22, 23 years. That's typical. And even today, although it's higher because most people go out to work and they don't get married so early now, but in the ancient world and even in parts of Africa today, you have children getting married at the age of 13 and 14. So it's about 22, 23 years. So they'd use this number, this 23 years, and they multiply it by the so-called 12 generations that divide into 480 years, and that's how they come up with a shorter figure.
Mainstream Christianity and scholars alike seem to ignore the biblical and archaeological proof, those being that if Ramesses was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, one would find death and destruction of Egypt's military might, along with an economic collapse in the archaeological record. However, it is exactly the opposite. We know Ramesses II was the great builder who brought Egypt into the Golden Age, and on the biblical side, the Merneptah Stela, mentioning Israel as a nation seems like strong evidence that we can no longer accept this current view on the chronology timeline that Ramesses is the Pharaoh of depression. Why then do they continue to hold this perspective?
It's one of those wonderful circular arguments that we have in scholarship. Exodus 1:11, that's where we get this statement that the Israelite slaves built this city called Ramesses. So they automatically assume that Ramesses II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Then when they look at the archaeology of the time, when you look at Israel, the Holy Land, or when you look at Egypt, you find absolutely no evidence of anything catastrophic happening in Egypt. I mean, it's one of the strongest periods, one of the greatest kings of Egypt. No calamities going on there, no destruction of the army, no destruction of the civilization itself. And when you look a little bit further along and look in Israel, in the Promised Land, you find no destructions of cities 40 years later like Jericho. So there's absolutely zero evidence in the time of Ramesses II of these biblical events. So what they then do is they say, well, the Bible is a work of fiction. In other words, they use the Bible to date Ramesses II, and they put the whole thing together, making him the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and then they dismiss the Bible as a work of fiction as a result of that.
I was just kind of with that thought. I mean, one would think that, especially with biblical scholars and whatnot, that you have this great Pharaoh in Egypt who did this, and it's like a standoff against the great God of the Israelites. So it's like this epic battle, I would to some, you know.
Yeah.
And that's why I think they would probably choose Ramesses as well. I mean, as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, because he's this great figure in Egypt's history.
But you've got to have archaeological evidence to show that a disaster happened at the time. And that's not a period when Egypt was at all weak. It was one of its strongest eras. So when you look for the Exodus, you have to find a period of Egyptian history when there is a catastrophe, when there's a breakdown of civilization, when the Egyptians are not as powerful and as strong as they were in previous periods.
That actually leads me to ask a question that I wasn't able to add in yet. And it's
Right.
posed by Jim Evans from HAMA, which is the Historical African Martial Arts Association. I always give those guys a props. They do some great work on African fighting throughout history. And his question for you, Dr. Rohl, involves if you believe the Bible is a reliable source. And I'd wonder if you would clarify and explain on that.
I do. I believe that the Bible is a reliable source. I don't see why we have to somehow treat it differently to any other ancient record. I mean, we take the Babylonian records as serious. We take the Egyptian ones as serious. We look at the events in there. We analyze them and compare them to the archaeology and try to fit them all together. Why don't we do that with the Bible as well? I can't see what the big problem is there. So, all right, it's a book about the relationship between God and his people, but it's also a history book. There's a narrative history going on there, a framework around which the religious ideas are enveloped. So yes, why not accept it and treat it seriously as a history book? If it proves on certain occasions not to be valid, fair enough. But if you actually get the chronology right and you tie it in with the biblical events and Egyptian events, you find a very, very interesting pattern that does work, but not if you have Ramesses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
In the 4 pillars of Egyptian chronology you laid out in your work, you mentioned that the last pillar is built upon astronomy, and given some of the calculations, they range over 75 years to the 52nd regnal date of Ramesses II. If we have already predetermined that the 19th dynasty falls within the 13th century, given this foundation, why would academia not be willing to look back on it with hesitation and admit that we need a better chronological order?
It's how it's all constructed, really. I mean, the year 52 date that we're talking about here, which is the 4th main pillar of Egyptian chronology, is a lunar date. Now, lunar dates repeat themselves every 25 years. So you can shift the chronology 25 years this way or 25 years that way. No problems. Egyptologists will reasonably do that. But there are other key links that have established this date for Ramesses II in the 13th century. So you've only got a range of about 100 years where you can shift that lunar date backwards and forwards. But of course, if you go to a different radical dating system whereby Ramesses II is not of the 13th century, you can pick your date within those 25-year cycles, those lunar cycles. So that's only a fine-tuning element of the story. The bigger picture is what we do with the chronology in terms of the other pillars. We start with a 664 BC date, which is the one that everybody accepts as the time when Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, sacked Thebes in Egypt. He came down there and destroyed the city. That date is pretty much fixed by everybody, and I'm quite happy with that one. But then we get this one that goes a little bit earlier than that, in 925 BC, the real problem one, which is where we get this Pharaoh Shoshenq, who is the founder of the 22nd dynasty, linked to the biblical Pharaoh Shishak, who sacked the Temple of Solomon. Now, that happened in 925 BC, according to the Bible dating, in the time of Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon, so 5 years after Solomon died. And so Shoshenq is dated by the Bible. In other words, they make Shoshenq into Shishak. They give him a date of 925 B for the sack of the Temple of Solomon, and they start his reign, therefore, in 945 BC, because he had a reign of 21 years. And that's where we get the beginning of the 22nd dynasty. It's not determined by the Egyptian archaeological evidence, the internal evidence. It's determined by the biblical date. So there's another beautiful circular argument, isn't it? They give an Egyptian pharaoh a biblical date, and then they work out the date of Ramesses by working backwards from that pharaoh's 22nd dynasty start, back through the 21st dynasty and the 20th dynasty, and they get back to Ramesses, and they put him in the 13th century because of that, and then they say the Bible's a work of fiction. So they're using the Bible to date Egyptian chronology, and then they're using Egyptian chronology to dismiss the Bible.
Wow.
Big wow, you see. Big wow. You have to listen to this.
All right. So finally, if chronology is to be reconstructed, like if we're from here on out, where do we start from, and what do we use as our base? If we're going to, do we just go back to the first pillar and then say, okay, anything like the second, third, and fourth pillar, are we going to just look at again, and where do we start if we're going to reconstruct chronology?
In any other discipline, you would start with the internal evidence of that discipline. You would not use the Bible to date Egyptian history. You'd start with the Egyptian evidence. That's where you must begin. If later on you then look outside Egypt to find synchronisms with the biblical story or the story of Canaan or whatever it is, then you can start to compare the two and try to match them up. But you don't start from the premise that you must date Egyptian history through the Bible. That is the wrong way to go about it. So what you need to do is to see where the evidence leads you from the Egyptian evidence. And we have some very important genealogies that we can use. The genealogy of Knemebre, one of the Memphite priests, is a long list of generations going back for 1,000 years. And we have these lists of the different officers within the genealogy. A lot of them were viziers and a lot of them were royal architects. And so you end up going backwards through 14 generations from this guy called Knemebre. Now, he was a vizier and architect, royal architect, in the reign of Darius I, the Persian emperor, who came over to Egypt. And in his year 1026, this record was carved in the desert of this genealogy. And you can work back 14 generations. You get to a guy who's actually the guy who was the royal architect for Shoshenq I, the guy we mentioned earlier on. And if you do a quick calculation, you end up then with Shoshenq I around 820 BC. Now, 820 BC is about 125 years later than the biblical date that Shoshenq's given through the sack of the Temple of Solomon, year 5 of Rehoboam. So there you see already we have a 125-year discrepancy between what the Bible says and what Egyptologists think is the identification of Shishak and the actual date of Shoshenq in Egypt, about 125 years later. Now, that is very complicated, I admit, but the maths are pretty good, and the genealogy is very solid, and so we have to start with the Egyptian evidence. And then once you've constructed the Egyptian evidence, and if you now work back from Shoshenq I towards Ramesses II, you get an entirely different date for King Ramesses. Instead of him being in the 13th century, he ends up in the 10th century, and that is a huge difference.
I do want to ask one question, and an academic online had posed that I ask you this question as like a devil's advocate style.
Yeah. Is this academic anonymous?
Yes, it is. Yes, yes. I told them that they had requested that I not bring up their name, and so I always stick.
As long as it wasn't my favorite Prof. Eric Klein, I don't mind. And you did a great interview with him earlier.
Oh yeah, oh my gosh, I love his work. He's one of my favorites, definitely.
Yeah, he's a great character as well.
He is. My question would be carbon dating. How do you feel about
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Give us your thoughts.
And this is a lovely escape, isn't it, this one? Radiocarbon dating, we all know the principle, don't we? I mean, you get a sample of something that used to live in the past, and you see the degeneration of the carbon in the sample, etc., and it gives you a date. And you've got a lovely straight line curve decay rate, okay? But then we have this thing called calibration. using dendrochronology, where they use tree rings. And the calibration curve completely changes our concept of where you plot those dates along that straight line. It wiggles all over the place. And so there are lots of reasons why that calibration could be dodgy. There are also reasons why you can get old carbon in a sample as well. So, for instance, let's give you an example, a ridiculous example, admittedly, but let's give you an example anyway. You pick up a plant out of the ground on Thera, the volcanic island of Thera, okay? And they've done this, and they've radiocarbon dated it. Now, that was done in the 1960s, I believe, and they got a radiocarbon date of the 11th century AD. So that's something like 900 years older than the actual growing plant in the ground and Thera. And it's called the old carbon effect because you've got venting going on of old carbon coming out of the volcano. So when they try to date the grain seeds from Thera during the Theran eruption that happened when they were in the jars there, those grains are contaminated. Those grains have been growing in the ground on a volcanic island, which is blowing its top over a period of time. So, of course, it's going to have artificial aging in it. And there are many, many other reasons why radiocarbon is a big problem. For example, the Theran eruption, according to radiocarbon dating, takes us back to something in the 1650s, a date on the radiocarbon basis. But when we look at the archaeology in Egypt, Professor Manfred Bitak has found Theran pumice at his site in the time of Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. Okay, and it's the only time we find Theran pumice in Egypt. In other words, we don't find it earlier and we don't find it later. So he says the Theran eruption must have taken place in the reign of Thutmose III. And yet the date, the radiocarbon date, puts it back into the Hyksos period. So you've got a massive discrepancy between the archaeology and what radiocarbon dating is telling us. And I prefer to use the archaeology rather than the radiocarbon dating.
That's very interesting.
Stick that in your pipe, Prof.
I know quite a few of my subs are going to love your answer to that, because that's a question I get all the time. Is they have questions about carbon dating, and I'm just a novice, and so I don't like giving questions answers as if I actually know, right? So I always like to get his opinions on that. That's very interesting.
Okay, and this one was brought up on the forum on Nick's Facebook at one point. Could you expand on the Amarna letters and the Habaru during the reign of Akhenaten? What exactly did we find there?
It's a very famous archive of letters. We call them the Amana letters, that was found at Tel el-Amarna, the capital city of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. And he's usually dated to around 1350 BC. Okay, so that's when he's normally placed. But I would date him a lot later than that. I would put him in around 1022 BC. So again, like Ramesses, we're moving him down in time relative to the biblical timeline. And of course, that would place him roughly in the time of King David and King Saul before that. So when we look at the Amana letters, to test out my chronological scheme, you would have all these records of writings between the city rulers of Canaan to Pharaoh, which you could then check against the biblical stories in the books of Samuel. So you've got a very good way of testing my dating scheme to see how the two things compare. So these Amana letters are written in cuneiform, and they're on clay tablets. And so we have to realize that they're actually written in that language. And sometimes the actual language is Akkadian. Other times it's Canaanite. It's a slightly different version of the language. And in fact, it's true to say that Albright said that certain groups of these letters, a small group of them, were actually written in what he calls very early Hebrew. Now, that would be impossible if Ramesses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus, because we're talking about 100 years before Ramesses II when these letters were written. So what are these Hebrew letters doing in this Amana correspondence? So, for instance, one of the characters who writes to Pharaoh, he has a couple of letters he's written to Pharaoh. One is called EA 252. EA just means El Amana, letter 252. And he is actually talking in that letter about taking back two of the cities that the Indo-European rulers of the coastal plain had seized from him, taken from him. And he's saying, I'm just taking back my two cities. And of course, that matches very well with the time of King Saul, because he does exactly the same thing. He takes his hometown of Gibeah, Jebah, back from the Philistines, and he takes Michmash back as well, which is another town very close to Jebah. So you have a correspondence there between this character called Labaya and King Saul of the Bible, both of whom are revolting against what we would call Indo-European rulers, in which the Bible calls Philistines. So we have a very close match there. One other letter that he writes to Pharaoh, that's EA 256, he talks about he didn't realize that his son was consorting with the Habiru, these Habiru sort of bandits who are in the hill country, and he was shocked to find out that his son had been consorting with them. That's exactly the same as the story of King Saul, because he's writing, or the story tells us, that Saul was absolutely flabbergasted that his son Jonathan had been consorting with David, the Hebrew rebel, who was out in the hill country. So the stories match very closely. And both of the characters, Labiah, which means the lion of something or other, maybe even the lion of Yah, that's a possibility. He died close to Mount Gilboa, and all the reports in the Amana letters tell us that this King Labiah also died somewhere close to Gilboa, as Saul did. So we have a situation where these two rulers of the hill country, Labiah and Saul, have virtually identical lives in terms of their political history. And so you find the territories are the same as well. We know that. So in fact, Finkelstein actually tells us, or he says in his paper, that Saul was the last Labiah. Well, I'm saying, well, hang on a minute, take those 300 years out and Saul is Labiah.
Wow.
Complicated again, I know. Well, you did ask the question.
I appreciate it. That was great. I know there's, like I said, there's been people that have been asking about that and trying to make correlations. So, just to expound on that, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Well, the thing is that a lot of people would argue that the Amana period was the time when Joshua brought the Israelites into Egypt and sacked the cities, of course. In the time of the conquest. That would be a traditional view. But of course, Jericho didn't exist at that time. It would have been a ruin for centuries. And the actual letters themselves don't really describe an invasion of Hebrews coming into the area. It describes a revolt against Philistine overlordship. That's really what it's describing there. And so many of the characters that are mentioned in those letters, one letter called EA 256, which is written by a king called Mutbal, who is the son of Labiah. So Labiah is now dead, he's been killed, somewhere near Mount Gilboa, and Mutbal is writing to Pharaoh, and he tells us about certain characters in one letter, EA 256. Now, Saul had a son called Ishbaal, which means the man of Baal. Labiah had a son called Mutbal, which means the man of Baal in Canaanite. Okay, so again, the names match. And he refers to a number of people in this letter. One of them is Ayab. Now, Ayab apparently is out somewhere, and he can't report him back to Pharaoh. He doesn't know where he is. But of course, Ayab is a Canaanite version of the name Joab, and Joab was the general of David. And he also refers to somebody called Yeshua. Now, Yeshua, that's the name Yishai, which is the name Jesse, the father of David. So you have two characters there, which are actually in the books of Samuel. And a third character is mentioned too. He's called Dadua. And Dadua is the Canaanite name for David. So we have all these names in this one letter which match the names of the people, the main characters in the books of Samuel. And I think that is pretty staggering.
It's kind of hard to say that was a coincidence.
Well, it could be. Why not?
It's no secret to anyone that follows my channel, I love the Bronze Age collapse. My question for you is, what are your thoughts on the Bronze Age collapse, but more importantly, the chronology of the collapse?
Well, again, my favorite prof, Eric Klein, is the one who has expounded upon this idea, and it's a brilliant book that he wrote on it, 1177. But of course, 1177 in the title is on the conventional dating scheme. I would put that collapse around 860. Okay, so much, much later in time. Now, what is the effect of that? Think about what's happening here. We've got Cecil Tor and Petrie arguing about the date of the Mycenaean Bronze Age, okay? And Petrie's saying we have to push it back to the 13th, 14th centuries because of Amana and the dating of Akhenaten, etc., etc. I'm saying with the revised chronology, when we shift the dating down, we end up with the invasion of the Philistines coming down towards Egypt, not in 1177, but around 1166, 68, around that period of time. So what does that do to the Greek Dark Age? It ends up disappearing. because the 300-year dark age between that earlier date and the date I've given is when we put this dark age into Greek history. We don't have any evidence for that dark age other than the fact we have this black hole because the time has been stretched artificially. So you end up with cemeteries where you have a tiny population of burials because it's spread over 300 years. But you take those 300 years out and you have a normal rate of burial in the cemeteries at Athens and other places. And then the Greeks themselves have no memory of a dark age. They have genealogies going back to the heroic age and the Trojan War that don't refer to a dark age and don't have all these generations between the two. So the Egyptian chronology being revised not only affects the synchronisms between the Bible and Egypt, but it also affects the synchronisms between the Greek history and the Egyptians. And it removes that silly dark age that we have in the Greek history, which the Greeks didn't even know about.
Interesting. Can I, even though now I'm lying because I said I wouldn't ask you another question,
Go on.
Follow up on now. So that's really interesting. I like that. I know my subs are going to like this as well. My next question is an additional one to this. A lot of times the Greek Dark Ages are referred to as a period in which the ancient Greeks basically forgot how to read and write. I'm sure you've read that. I've read that. Nathan's read that. And eventually they're going to, if I remember correctly, adopt the Phoenician alphabet and build on top of that. Would the absence of a dark age change that whole outlook?
It does. And it changes the whole story of Homer as well, because Homer, of course, is writing about the Trojan War 300 and something years after it happened. This is pretty brilliant for a guy who was supposedly blind and never visited the site. So how did he get the information? So if you take the 300 years out, you end up with Homer writing, as you say, in the Greek script, which is borrowed from the Phoenicians, which is borrowed in turn from the Israelites in this new chronology. So we have a pattern of development of the script. He's writing and singing about stories which are only probably 2 generations before his time. That's the effect of reducing the Dark Age to virtually nothing. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't a collapse. Certainly, Eric Klein is absolutely right about the collapse. But I would say because of this new chronology, we can now say that one of the main reasons for the collapse is the Trojan War itself. Because the Greek Bronze Age kings were all over there in Anatolia fighting this 10-year war, ignoring what was going on back at home. And so the economy of Greece collapsed as a result of that. And of course, we have a series of earthquakes as well. So there are a whole things, climate change going on, everything. But what really is important is this Dark Age now is almost reduced to nothing. So instead of having a massive 300-year Dark Age where everybody forgets everything, and including the Trojans who are building or making Greg minionware at Troy in the Trojan War, and then 300 years later, having disappeared off the face of the planet, they come back and make the same pottery. It makes no sense at all. 300-year gap, the same pottery being made, and they come back to the same location. They build exactly the same pottery and they were making 300 years earlier. No. Sorry, that doesn't work. Same thing with the language, same thing with the script. You get rid of that Dark Age and it solves everything. And it also means that Aeneas can skiddle across to Carthage, fall in love with Dido, and then go and form the Roman Republic, if you like, the kings before the Republic, as the founder of that dynasty, as according to traditional Roman history. Now, you can't have that with a 300-year Dark Age. Could he actually be a 300-year boyfriend of the Queen of Carthage, which doesn't make sense to me at all.
Wow.
I mean, just shortening that, I mean, it brings a lot of things into perspective, I'll say that much. I mean, there's a lot of implications there, and that is something that is very interesting.
It's all part of this new chronology, really. I mean, once you get the Egyptian chronology right, it solves so many problems in the ancient world timeline, and it affects the Roman history, it affects Greek history, it affects Anatolian history, it obviously affects biblical history as well. It confirms some of the biblical stories. So it's a win-win-win, folks.
Actually, I do have one follow-up. And is there a committee or something going on in the academic world to look at chronology and revise the chronology today? Is that gaining traction in academia?
I can't really say it is. It's probably a little bit similar to continental drift theory. You know, that took like 20, 30 years to get accepted by academia. I reckon I'll be long gone before anybody comes around to accepting what I'm suggesting here. It's just too ingrained. It's just too well established. Even if they see the arguments as to why you can deconstruct Egyptian chronology, they're not happy about the reconstruction of it. And I think if you're going to deconstruct Egyptology and ancient history, you have to offer an alternative. It's simply destroying something is not the way to do it. You have to then come back with a suggestion as to how you can reconstruct it. And I think, unfortunately, that most academics these days, although some of the younger ones are quite open to these ideas and are very interested in them, and there are a growing number of them in that case, but you're still, you know, you're within the university system, and if you start trying to put ideas like this together, they're far too revolutionary for the establishment. And I think it's going to take many, many decades more before we actually probably find some more confirmatory evidence that will actually come out of the ground, which will say unequivocally that this dating scheme that we have at the moment is wrong, and then we have to revise the chronology. And maybe somebody will come out with a better version than mine. That's entirely possible.
And also, for my audience who's watching these episodes, just know, always check out the links in the video description below. I'm going to provide links to his academia profile, website, his books that you can purchase. Give him the entirety of your support. Check out what he has to say, and really take advantage of his research and everything that he's done to not only put forward his thoughts on new chronology, but a variety of other subjects as well, stretching from Sumer to Egypt and beyond. Dr. Rohl, thank you so much for coming on today.
It's my pleasure. And it's been great fun. Both of you are terrific guys. Well done.